Okay, now we'll be moving to a panel discussion on aspirations, stigma, and beliefs, and this will be moderated by, just put the slides up, by Hazel Marcus, who's the Davis Brack Professor in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University and the faculty director at Stanford Spark, as well as Catherine Thomas, who's a PhD student in social psychology at Stanford and also part of the Spark team.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. Catherine Thomas has been telling me about these sessions for a couple of years, and she's been sending me papers, but this is the first time I had the opportunity to come to a convening, and it really fuels my idea that the disciplines have outlived their usefulness, and we really just have to come together around problems. This is amazing. There's so much room here for connections and going in different directions. And the papers that we've heard today, I've just loved it, and they suggest a really bright future for this kind of integration. And I think if we can just reconcile our cultural differences among the disciplines, which are huge, as we know, if we can get over those and see our differences as not as deficits, but as strengths, we're going to be really on our way. So I'm excited that this could happen. I've been waiting for this for a long time. Toward that end, what Catherine thought I should do, and I want to take some minutes to do, is just to quickly describe some of the work that I have done with a whole set of colleagues on the power of aspirations. We are social and cultural psychologists, and what we've learned about when and how these aspirations drive behavior, as well as what to watch out for, in particular cultural differences on the role of aspirations. So Paula Narias, Daphne Oyserman, Susan Cross, and I developed a theory of possible selves. We are very excited about this because, as Travis started off the session with this morning, we know as psychologists, I mean even since William James, about the power of the imagination, of hope, of optimism, about the future to drive behavior. As social psychologists, we know, this is a quote from Rayon Wright Edelman, who's been a child advocate all of her life, the simple thing is you can't be what you can't see. So in this work, we define possible selves in this way, as elements of the self-concept, and the self-concept is what mediates and regulates all behavior, cognition, emotion, motivation. The self-concept, elements of the self-concept that represent what individuals could become, they'd like to become, or are afraid of becoming. And importantly, these aren't just any set of imagined roles or states of being. Instead, they represent specific, individually significant hopes, fears, and fantasies. That's why we call them possible selves. And many of these selves we found are the direct result of previous social comparisons. What others are now, I could become. That's why it matters so much who's in your social networks. So long, very research story short, I would tell you that possible selves we know are effective in motivating behavior and are likely to have long-term positive effects. And you will see that the positive effects and long-term, what we mean by that differs from what you economists mean. You have really cool outcomes, better than ours. But what we know is that hope for selves are more effective when they're paired with feared selves in the same domain. Two, there's a clear and viable pathway from the now self to the future possible self. Someone's got to build that bridge. The person and others around have to make that bridge. Possible selves are more effective when they're recognized by the important others in the community. Other people know that you have these possible selves. And they fit rather than conflict with relevant, prevalent values, practices, and norms. And finally, most of this work has been done in communities that are well-resourced, communities, context of abundance rather than of scarcity. So in this research, and this is where I did a lot of this work, and then it was clear to us that we are working in American, Western context, what we call in social psychology, referred to earlier today as the weird context. You know, those are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic contexts, which generously describes about 15% of the world's cultural context. So we know a lot about that world, those worlds, but it seemed to us what people hoped for, what they believed was possible, was an untapped spring of agency. Possible selves were the ultimate expression of your own free choice. You can use your imagination to individually tailor and custom craft them, and they can guide your behavior. And this, of course, can help you feel in control and responsible for your fate and your future. And then we started to work outside the West, in contexts in China, in Korea, in Japan, in India. Now, these are vast areas of the world that are not, as the U.S. is, individualist in orientation. They, of course, recognize and experience the individual self, but they don't prioritize the individual and what the individual wants, thinks, and feels. Instead, they tend to prioritize what the family, what the extended family, what the group or the social unit one associates with expects and needs. So this makes a huge difference, I want to argue, in how we conceptualize aspirations. And this work has led us to the generalizations that are on this slide. So very quickly, let me give you an example of why we've had to expand our understanding of possible selves and how they work. So I'm going to set up a little dilemma for you. Your house is on fire. I'm sorry. Inside, your mother is asleep in one bedroom. You come home from work and you see this, and your spouse is asleep in another bedroom. If you don't have one of those, just simulate it. You have time to only recognize one of them. Who could you save? Who do you choose to save, your mother or your spouse? I don't have time to ask you, but think about it for a minute. And what I want you to see is that for people in the U.S., over here on the left-hand bar, right here, across age and across a whole variety of conditions, the answer is pretty obvious. They say, my spouse, of course. They say, this is the person who shares my hope, shares my aspirations, and who I have chosen to spend my life with. Yet, as you see, in Taiwan, in this case, it's also true in other studies in Ghana, the answer is also obvious, although it's completely different. They say, my mother. My mother, my parents, they gave me life. I would not be here without them. My role, my obligation as their child is to save them, to protect them, filial piety. You can always get another spouse. Both answers, here's the quandary, both answers to whom to save are right. Neither is wrong. It's not like the Taiwanese answer is some, oppressed answer of people who are under some sort of terrible pressure. It's the right answer to the question in that culture. Now, we've seen in hundreds of studies, many, many people across many related disciplines too, is that the model of agency we take for granted in the West, the default model, is not the only form of agency. And here I'm going to show you another slide. Agency always involves others. You can't have it by yourself, but the role, because we're social species, but the role of others varies. Here's two models. They both show the self in the middle, surrounded by important others. In individualist context, on the left, agency, or the self, takes this independent form. This is the default model. What matters most is what's shown here in blue, personal interests, preferences, and goals. In more collectivist context, on the right, the self and agency take this more interdependent form. What matters most are relationships, roles, obligations, and norms. That's what matters, what other people think of you and how you respond to that. People everywhere have both of these ways of thinking about themselves, but cultural contexts differ in which is emphasized. So most of the work on aspirations and possible selves assumes that agency takes this very independent form. This is the rational actor model. It's common throughout the social sciences. It's not, but it can take a more interdependent form. And if it takes a more interdependent form, is what I want to suggest for discussion today. The content, the form, the function of possible selves that drive behavior is likely to be different, and we might think about measuring them in different ways, and we might think about intervening in different ways with other ideas. So I want to just show you that one study. Now, in the US, the answer to what drives behavior is pretty obvious. In the words of Steve Jobs, have the courage to follow your heart and to intuition. They somehow already know what you want to become. And of course, Oprah agrees. Feel the power that comes from focusing on what's inside you. These are pretty clear examples of explaining behavior with an independent model of agency. It's the self-efficacy. It's your sense of your locus of control. You can give it a million names, and we do in psychology, but it's what's in here that's powering the behavior that's driving the bus. Now, in a recent study with PISA data, which stands for Program in International Student Assessment, it contains data on achievement from 1.2 million 15-year-olds in 59 countries, and is done every few years. And these countries, in this case, 59 societies that vary in individualism and collectivism. Our question was, does passion, which we defined as self-efficacy, interest, and enjoyment, make a difference for achievement in reading, math, and science, which there was data on in this? And we find that Jobs and Oprah are right, mostly. For individualist cultures, they're mostly right, where independent models of self are prevalent. What you see here is the correlation between passion and achievement on the y-axis, plotted against individualism on the x-axis. Again, passion defined as self-efficacy, interest, and enjoyment, more highly correlated with achievement in the individualist context. Over on the right here, you can just see a couple of them that stand out: UK, Netherlands, Canada. The correlation is much lower in collectivist contexts where interdependent models of the self and of agency are common. Chile, Vietnam, China, sort of shown in red over here. So the question is, what correlated with achievement in more interdependent contexts? Now, in some countries where PISA was administered, not all of them, they included a questionnaire to parents, which measured whether the parents supported their children and how much help the parents gave to the students. And what you can see here is in these more interdependent cultural contexts, Korea, Hong Kong, Mexico, it is support from parents, the support of these parents who our respondents tell us they would save in a fire, if that was the case, that is a predictor of achievement. In fact, this support from parents is as strong a predictor as the passion was in the for them. Yet you can see that parental support over here in France, in Germany, and the UK has very little correlation with achievement. So parental support just isn't something that's culturally understood to be as important as it is in the collectivist context. So it could be, and this is what we want to suggest today, is that the expression of personal individual interest, enjoyment, excitement is not always important in high achievement. It could be that for many 15-year-olds outside the Weird West, motivation, in addition to passion, springs from fulfilling relational obligations and expectations. And so I just want to mention in laboratory studies that I've done with Krishna Savani and a number of students, we've looked very closely at what happens when you express your personal preferences, what's inside the blue highlighted area here, and you guide your behavior through making choices based on these internal preferences and feelings, because that's the usual default model. And what we find, and brings us to stigma, it's in contexts where people live in poverty circumstances, they are likely to experience interdependent agency and to be very concerned with the relationships and others' expectations. They're encouraged, if they are encouraged, as with many of our interventions, to think about their own interests, their own preferences, and to choose accordingly. They may behave in ways that are not in their community's best interests. So let me just give you a couple of examples of this. The sort of thing we did is to do laboratory studies in which we ask respondents to express their preferences and choose among sets of common objects: candy bars, key rings, greeting cards. The point of making this choice among the four of these is to activate a mindset of personal choice and preference, and then to examine the consequences of expressing your aspirations and your preferences and your choice. In a control condition, respondents didn't choose, they just described each item. And we find that thinking about what you want, what is good for you, and choosing on the basis of that changes behavior. Compared to the control condition, people in the choice condition, making these simple choices, not related to what came later, are subsequently more likely to blame victims for their, not circumstances, for their financial woes, for relationship problems. They are more likely to accept wealth inequality and expect, let's say that's just how it is. They are also less likely to endorse government policies like eco-friendly policies that might enhance the public good, just a result of being engaging in the expressing of preferences and choosing. And I'll just show you just one quick example. Here's one which we showed respondents who made these choices, incidental choices, earlier. And they are shown an appeal from the Save Our Children Foundation about a child in poverty who's hungry. And once a choice mindset has been activated, respondents, as you can see here, donate less. They're less sympathetic. They think it's much less a matter of morality. They're less touched. They're less sorry for the poor child just after making the choices. So it's a very controlled laboratory study, but the idea, and I think it has lots of ramifications for how we're thinking, choosing based on one's preferences and personal aspirations can have multiple positive individual consequences. We've seen lots of them today, impressive ones today, for motivation, for achievement, for economic activity, for well-being. But they can, and I think we need to think this through, also cause problems. They can make people different, make them behave in non-normative ways. They can stigmatize people within their communities. And very, very importantly, and we're getting to this in the last couple of talks, it can also reduce empathy among the public for those people who are facing these hardships. And we can see that's one of the big problems. And we recently summarized this in a paper that has this title, The Paradoxical Consequences of Choice, often good for the individual, perhaps less so for the society. And we include charts like this where we show some of the cognitive consequences, some of the motivational consequences for the individual, and then we have a variety of collective consequences that don't look like they're so good overall for people, but of course it's just a start. So I just want to say that this work overall supports the real importance of aspirations in behavior, but suggests some potential pitfalls. It raises the specter of stigma and how important it is for us to understand it, underscores the values of understanding the cultural context and of understanding how agency is conceived in various contexts, and of trying to tune our manipulations and our interventions on aspirations, goals, self-efficacy, and control in the direction of what's valued and meaningful in those contexts. And I think from what I've heard today, that could be really simple, and I would guess that we could have show even better effects. And now I want to stop. I want to turn over to Catherine because we want to talk about these great papers we've just heard and pose some really specific questions about these great papers. But I do want to say that I appreciate having a chance to talk about this, and if you let me, I'll be back. This is a great convening.
Is this on? Okay, great. Thanks, Hazel. So I think these papers are really exciting because they reveal an overlooked source of economic inequality. Like many of the papers that we've seen today, they showed that aspirations and stigma are powerful determinants of kind of economic outcomes, but also they present a really attractive policy lever. They're low cost, low touch to address these issues. And I think together these papers help us address two questions, among many others. But the first one was that they demonstrate why aspirations are low in contexts of poverty. Hazel noted that kind of correlationally in weird contexts, aspirations are lower. One reason that might be is because of the financial insecurity of poverty. I think Madeline's research pointed to that. Research in Ethiopia and Brazil suggested that a second driver might be the social context. So we might think of people having less access to role models. There might be kind of aspiration deserts. And second, they show us how to increase aspirations and stigma. So in Ethiopia, we saw one strategy that's actually quite common in the public health literature of positive deviance. So taking an example of someone who's already shown success in that context and illustrating their example to others. In Brazil, we saw transmission through peers, which Hazel would, the research of Hazel would suggest that that's particularly important in more interdependent contexts. And then we saw in the US that intervening at the first point of contact for a program on the mailer and shifting the social meaning of the program can be quite powerful. So now this set of papers raises many interesting questions. The first that I wanted to highlight is picking up where Hazel left off. that actually directly links aspirations and stigma, or potentially links them. So this is a possible tension between individual and societal level consequences. To elaborate that a bit further, many interventions that raise aspirations can increase individuals' feelings of agency and internal locus of control. But we also saw that the paper of Lasky, Fink, and Linos was "It's Not Your Fault." It sought to shift people away from seeing financial insecurity as being something that people have control over. So, while raising aspirations and leading people to see their fate as being in their hands can improve individual outcomes, might it have unintended negative consequences on society for those who can't make their aspirations come true, and potentially for even exacerbating economic inequality. So the question that I wanted to ask is, how might we think about this, measure this, and ultimately avoid such unintended consequences as we pursue this research agenda on aspirations?
Hi, at a risk of sounding like simplistic, but it sounds to me like there has to be also an emphasis on morally looking at the context of everyone and realizing and emphasizing as much as aspirations that you are not an island and that you are in a context and that you also retrieve benefits from being in a social group. So maybe more emphasis on solidarity, or, it's. I've always said that here in the U.S., solidarity is a word that you hardly hear.
Never.
And I think it's important that we start popularizing the term.
Thanks. These are great thoughts, and I mean, I think I really agree that that there can be these potentially negative consequences if you just have an intervention to increase aspirations, and potentially the individual is still facing a great degree of structural barriers, and so through no fault of their own, they may not be able to reach those aspirations that can lead to guilt, self-blame, or if they do reach their goals, maybe they blame others, right? And so I just always am wondering about the degree to which these interventions can always sort of be reminding people of the structural barriers that do exist, and also simultaneously being paired with pathways or supports to not just give people the different mindset, but also the opportunities for getting beyond it. I recently was thinking about this in the context of growth mindset. I think David Yeager was giving a presentation, and he was mentioning about how the growth mindset intervention is, although it's often very successful for kids, it wasn't successful for kids who had teachers who did not also have a growth mindset. So teachers who would blame students for if they failed, it was due to their lack of efforts. Those students, even if they did have a higher growth mindset, were not seeing those, realizing those changes in their grades and outcomes. So again, it's like sort of changing the mindset of the students, but also it's changing the environment and support around them. And I think this maybe connects also to the sort of what you're talking about, the interdependence component as well.
They also found in that study, the National Growth Mindset Study, that it worked best in schools that had high challenge-seeking norms, which I actually, in the Brazil paper, that was pressure to work, something like that, we might call challenge-seeking. So supportive norms of the context that are driving that. And David's work really calls for a heterogeneity revolution in psychology. And that was actually my next question, was going to be, within psychological interventions in the U.S., a lot of movement has been pushed towards thinking about the social context that people operate in and they behave in. And I loved this quote from Lippert and Weidick's paper: aspirations cannot persist at higher levels without tangible evidence that they are achievable and realistic. So thank you for leading me to the next question, which I must ask as a social psychologist. So I wanted to ask, what would that evidence be that a person might need to see? And I was thinking of 3 possible domains. So one is economic opportunities that are available in the context. There's good work by Sherry Wu at UCLA and Alana Brody that's not just about objective opportunities, but it's also subjective opportunities in the context. The social affordances in the context, whether your teacher has a mindset, your peers are engaging challenge seeking and pushing you to exercise a growth mindset. And then the last one might be something about a fit with the cultural norms of the context. So as Hazel said, the self of I can be whatever I want is less likely to guide behavior in the many settings of the world where social norms of appropriate behavior require, for instance, filial piety or loyalty to your family, not standing out. So I wanted to ask if there are kind of features that people have seen built into their studies or could consider in studies going forward, where we might kind of think more about this heterogeneity, this moderation by social context, whether that's social features, social norms, culture, or economic opportunities.
I really enjoyed your presentation and especially Hazel's presentation and the way she introduced the difference between individualistic and collectivist societies, the example with the fire, and it made me think, what if we made a country where people don't have their parents? Well, wait a minute, that already exists. It's called the United States. It's a country of immigrants. Everybody comes here without their parents by definition. So I was thinking that to answer your question, why don't we look at communities of people, either entire countries or places in countries like cities where people have moved away from their parents, so they don't have this embeddedness within a social context. So that's my response to your question. It's a way of identifying possible determinants of that.
Yeah, it's really true. It's America, right? I mean, it's the U.S. Is where we do move away from our parents. We move across the country to take a job, and then all of a sudden we have a baby, and like, oh, whoa, what was that idea? And there's no one there to help. There's no one to take care. But of course, that's what the U.S. is all about: independence. Even from your family.
And relational mobility, I think, is something that you're also getting at. There's a lot of work in cultural psychology on relational mobility and how that kind of drives more independent psychological tendencies. Exactly. That might facilitate aspirations. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to answer kind of your first question too, and then maybe also a little bit of your second. I think when Travis and I started to think about aspirations, it was at a time when people were thinking the higher the aspirations are, the better, right? And I think over time, we've kind of come to think of like the optimal aspiration is what aligns with reality, right? The optimal self-efficacy is what actually reflects actual productivity, right, of somebody, and not something more, right? Because it's really easy to create a proof where you can show that if you have anything a belief that's anything other than reality, you're operating at some suboptimal level of investment, right? And then with respect to parents, it seems like educational aspirations among kids are malleable even among parents, right? That's was really obvious, like in Julio's presentation, that even if you can work on parents and sort of giving them a bigger vision of what their child could be, that in these more collectivist societies, that may be a really ripe area for interventions with aspirations, right?
There's actually been research in intimate partner relationships that suggests that when people kind of have these ideals of their romantic partner, that's actually very adaptive because it pushes the romantic partner to live up to those ideals. So it's kind of, you could imagine a similar process going forward for parents and their children.
Yeah, I do think that's really a powerful idea, and I also think that some of these just the clips we saw, the photos today, we're very close to making very effective possible selves. You take attractive people that are in your community that you could attach to is, it's not just that you want a goal or you want to feel like, I know I can do it, I have efficacy, but you see someone that you would like to be. This is, I think some of the interventions are coming very close to that. And then, of course, what has to be added to that, from my perspective, was be trying to build that pathway. You know, all the other things that we're talking about here, from the parents to the other people in the community, recognizing that that's what you want to be, that's a possible self. Daphne Oyserman, who's done a lot of work on this with low-income kids in Detroit, she finds that having the high school students go out and identify 2 adults, non-family members, and make a relationship with them and talk to those kids about, this is what they want to do. I want to become an engineer, and this is what I'm going to do when I'm an engineer. And this has very powerful effects on the possible self. So I think, you know, we're very close to coming together on a lot of ideas that could make even more powerful interventions.
What he just mentioned, it brought to mind the theory of the zone of proximal development. And maybe within aspirations, we should be looking at, okay, we shouldn't be talking about aspirations, but realistic aspirations and goals, and seeing them as a set of milestones to be met, and quantifying in a way your aspirations as being in a ladder, let's say, that you can reach one at a time, let's say.
I just wanted to complement Bruce's intervention, sparked kind of a few thoughts that came to mind, were the fact that one of the negative potential consequences of raising aspirations that has been recently found is not just feeling that people might be left behind, but also, as Bruce was hinting at, creating frustration that you're not actually getting to the higher goals. And I think there's evidence from the Philippines showing that raising aspirations is reducing savings among people that have been pushed too far. But then I guess one thing that came to mind, which relates to the parental influence and the collectivism, is recent research from the Gambia by Alex Hebo and Maya Squeta, finding that the complementarity of high aspirations and an educational intervention has positive effects on learning among children, where there was a randomized trial that combined, that had a bundle intervention on learning outcomes, and it was the parents that had higher aspirations that could make more out of it. But higher aspirations alone in that context weren't enough to push the needle on learning outcomes, which is one of the things that as policymakers we tend to care about. So yeah, those are just 2 complementary thoughts I had adding to Bruce's points in this discussion.
And I had one last question that is somewhat a link to the last few points that were made, which is asking about when aspirations might conflict with other goals that people have, or kind of the aspirations that we commonly see in these interventions. So, and this is about kind of goal conflicts and hierarchies that people might have. So Hazel suggested that individual aspirations can conflict with interdependent cultural values and norms. So for instance, if you adopt a new farming technology to pursue your goal of increased agricultural productivity, you might be flying in the face of practices that your elders have refined over decades and then taught you. And as another example, pursuing your personal aspirations can conflict with family obligations. So a study by Renee Shizelsak and Jeff Cohen found that a goal-setting intervention worked with thousands of online learners and MOOC, but it didn't work in India and China. And follow-up studies suggested that one reason was because it conflicted with family obligations among students. And failing to meet those kind of goals can even be a source of stigma. So kind of try to bring it back, the relationship to stigma there. So I'm interested and for anyone doing this sort of work on aspirations, have you seen those kind of goal conflicts occurring? Have you seen people just kind of naturally successfully navigating those? And how might we build in alignment between other goals and intervention designs.
No, it's a great question. I've actually thought about it in a little bit of the inverse, which is, and it goes back to this the point about this thing that the World Bank did internally, which is really a clever little study that I don't think it's been published. Has it been published? The one that was in the WDR, it has been published. So the development professionals usually can often systematically understate how hopeful poor individuals are in places like Kenya and in Jakarta and Peru. And there I think it's a little bit the question you're asking, but it's sort of the inverse, which is that in places that really value the collective and the family and belonging and identity in a social sense, that there are whole, or spiritual, right? That there are whole dimensions to the experience that Western researchers often miss. So it's not just that we don't appreciate, we look at their material circumstances and we think, this is the kind of person that is. It's that there are dimensions to their aspirations that are largely tied to the community or to their kids or to their faith, or there are dimensions that we miss, and then we sort of systematically expect them to be less hopeful or less knowledgeable or have lower aspirations than they actually do, right? And so I think it does go back to what Bruce said about like what's an optimal aspiration, right? It goes back to that in a couple of ways. One is that what's optimal may actually change once one constraint in the system is relaxed. The optimal aspiration may change, right? So it's in a model, you can write it down. You can find what an optimal aspiration is in a static model. But in reality, it's actually really hard, and these things are shifting as your circumstances are changing or constraints are changing or whatever else. So then you add to that, I think, the layer of whether you have the same set of values, and then whose sense of meaning or purpose or fulfillment is the basis for what we see as hopeful or hopeless, right? I think that's sort of the flip side, I think, of your question.
Mm-hmm.
I had I guess, you've pointed out a lot of really important considerations in designing these kinds of interventions. I was hoping to sort of ask you for maybe synthesized advice for people who then want to go out and do one of these. So I think every year at the convening, we see examples of interventions where I think we had like 4 papers like this presented last year, like where, someone designed, sometimes it's called a role model intervention, sometimes it's a self-efficacy intervention, sometimes an aspiration intervention, but it all has either the feature that I'm trying to intervene on your beliefs for your future, or showing you an example, like a video or something, an example of someone who's achieved success in the hopes that I change your beliefs or desire for what you want to do. And so I guess I'm just wondering if you were then to synthesize, since there's a plethora of these and they're expanding and they often show average impacts that are positive for long periods of time, I'm just wondering what your advice would be, given that people are going to continue to do a lot of these, on how to then both, like, to make them more effective. How would you, in cultural contexts that are more collective, like what would the right then form of an aspirations intervention look like? And then in general, what other advice would you give to a PhD student or somebody who wants to go out and develop one of these?
Well, first of all, what we've been saying here, which is somehow get to know the context. And you could go there and be in the field for 2 years. That would be ideal, but that's not, we have to publish 4 papers or 6 or 8 during that time. So it's hardly feasible anymore. But through partnering with people in the context, which I think we should, encourage anyway, the insider and the outside perspective on this. And I think maybe only through partnering should we do that, and really bringing people in as helping us co-design and co-designing and really understanding, what is of value, what is of meaning here, what really matters, and then the next big question is thinking which of these measures that we translate into 2 or 3 languages and back translate actually make any sense to the people who are answering them. But I think that's where if we work as a sort of consortium here, we have a lot of possibility to do that.
And then on that point of measurement from Hazel, something that I think about a lot is whether, or I look at in the papers, is whether they're attending to mental health and well-being, but also noticing that the well-being measures might be weird. So there's an interdependent happiness scale that researchers could consider using if they were in a more interdependent context, because happiness is a particularly high arousal positive affect that's very prized in the West, but not as much in all other cultures. Calmness and serenity is, I even find in Niger, that's research in East Asia supports that, but also in West Africa, I found that. So that's one thing. Just
the key item there that really works in interdependent happiness is I cannot be happy if the others around me are not happy. Americans are quite fine in general with being happy if the others aren't. And much of the rest of the world, that you just can't do that. So it's just a clue to what interdependent happiness could mean.
Right. So measuring well-being, but also being attentive, using locally kind of EMIC measures of well-being. And then Hazel and I actually kind of wrote a paper that kind of gives, one of the figures is actually going through considerations that you might think about when designing intervention, whether you're, for instance, straining loyalty, straining relationships versus supporting them, strengthening them. Are you asking people to defy authority if they kind of have respect for authority, if that's a key moral foundation? Are they able to kind of conform to that if they want? Are they able to fulfill important roles and obligations to other people? Are you asking women to not be mothers or to not be being pious in certain ways? So I think a really nice example of this from Indonesia is that one paper showed that women are increasingly wearing headscarves as they go pursue more economic opportunities. So enabling people to bring their religious practices into the pursuit of aspirations. So if anyone's interested, I can send you that paper, but it kind of has a list of these interdependent considerations for an intervention design.
Great. Unless there are any other comments, we're going to thank you guys so much. This was excellent discussion. Thanks. In the interest of time, we were thinking maybe we'd press on and just do the next two, the last session, the next two presentations, if that's okay with folks.